Mr. Roffey and his company, Roffey Bros and Nichols Contractors Limited, were given the task of renovating a bunch of apartment units. As with most serious work, they were given a clear deadline to meet, and this meant that for each day they delayed past the deadline, they would have to pay up extra money to their bosses as a penalty. Now, for this project, the company, we'll just call them Roffey Brothers from this point on, needed someone to do the carpentry work for them. So they looked around and they eventually found Mr. Williams, a carpenter who led a small team of men to do carpentry work. Once they liked each other enough, Roffey Brothers and Mr. Williams entered into a contract, under which Mr. Williams would do all the carpentry work for Roffey Brothers' project, and in return, Roffey Brothers would pay him £20,000. Now, let's pause here, because there's a really important fact that must be stated. £20,000 was way too little for the work that Mr. Williams had to do. He was being underpaid. So it goes without saying that Mr. Williams lost out on this contract. But let's not forget that Roffey Brothers had a deadline to meet, and if they didn't meet that deadline, they had to pay up extra money as a penalty. So if Mr. Williams went out of business, it would be very, very bad news for Roffey Brothers. And now, back to the story. Of course, as this is a contract law case, we can all guess that Mr. Williams almost went out of business because he had money problems. But Roffey Brothers couldn't let that happen, so they had a discussion and it was agreed that Roffey Brothers would pay Mr. Williams an additional £10,300 for exactly the same work. And then, this is the reason why they ended up in court, Roffey Brothers refused to pay up the additional money they had promised. Now, imagine you were Mr. Williams in this situation. First, you got underpaid. Then, you almost went out of business, and now Roffey Brothers is refusing to pay you as they promised. How can that be right? Well, as it turns out, Roffey Brothers had a powerful legal argument under their belt, and this rested on the doctrine of consideration. What is the doctrine of consideration? If you watched our video on it, you might remember that consideration is, in broad terms, the exchange of value. And you might also remember that if any promise isn't valuable in the eyes of the law will not enforce it. Now, at the end of our video on consideration, we also talked about the case where paying less money for the same thing is not valuable consideration, in the eyes of the law at least. Pretty much everyone agrees on this. But this wasn't one of those cases. Roffey Brothers wasn't paying less for the same thing, they were paying more for it. So did the same rule apply? Well, traditionally, yes, it did. Roffey Brothers mounted a powerful argument based on the really old case of Stilk and Myrick. In that case, 2 crew members on a ship ran away, and the captain promised to pay the remaining members extra money if they stayed. It was a promise to pay more for exactly the same work, and it was found that there was no consideration for that promise. So with the case of Stilk and Myrick backing them up, Roffey Brothers had an unbeatable argument that there was no consideration for their promise to pay Mr. Williams an extra £10,300, and because of that, the law would not enforce their promise. But how could that be right? If we look beyond the Stilk and Myrick case, and we keep in mind that consideration is simply the exchange of value, can we really say that Roffey Brothers got nothing valuable out of their promise? Remember, they had a deadline to meet, and if they didn't pay Mr. Williams and he went out of business, they would miss their deadline and have to pay up extra money as a penalty. And if they paid Mr. Williams as they promised, he could have stayed in business and Roffey Brothers might have caught the deadline. So even though there was nothing valuable about Roffey Brothers' promise to pay extra money for the same work, at least in the eyes of the law, in reality, there was everything valuable about it. That is, there was no legal benefit under the promise, but there was a practical benefit under it. What happened then? Did the law insist on a rigid application of the incredibly technical doctrine of consideration, or did it open its eyes and see what was happening in reality? Well, in this case, it chose to open its eyes. The Williams and Roffey Brothers case went on appeal to the UK Court of Appeal, where it was unanimously found that the practical benefit obtained by Roffey Brothers could be counted as valuable consideration in the eyes of the law. So that was the rather technical and really interesting case of Williams and Roffey Brothers. Really hope you enjoyed the video and hope it was useful for your understanding. Now, I'd like to make the usual caveat to our law students watching. I didn't include all the stuff that the case stood for, and I also cut out quite a bit of its facts. I've included some notes in the video description to deal with those, but don't forget to read this case yourself as well. Finally, I'd just like to give a huge shout out and massive thanks to Xiao Tong for the wonderful caricatures of Mr. Williams and Mr. Roffey. You can check out her stuff with the link in the description. And with all that said then, thank you so much for watching this video, and please take care of yourselves. Much cheers to you.